The Indian people were forced to bear the burden of British militarism. Their taxes were used to fund wars of conquest outside India's borders. The British used Indian revenues to invade China in the 1840s, sparking the Opium Wars that would have far-reaching consequences for both countries. The Indian people's taxes also funded the suppression of the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The British used Indian revenues to pay for the troops, ammunition, and equipment needed to quell the rebellion, ensuring that the Indian people were forced to pay for their own subjugation. This was not an isolated incident. The cost of all Britain's wars of conquest outside India's borders was consistently charged to Indian revenues. The Indian people were forced to fund the British Empire's expansionist ambitions, even as they suffered under the yoke of colonial rule. The British government and the East India Company used a complex system of accounting and budgeting to hide the true extent of India's contribution to British militarism. The use of Indian revenues to fund British wars of conquest was a deliberate policy, designed to shift the burden of imperialism onto the shoulders of the Indian people. As the British Empire continued to expand its reach, the Indian people were forced to bear an increasingly heavy burden. Their taxes funded British wars of conquest, while their resources were exploited to fuel British industry and commerce. India, a land of vast potential, was crippled by British rule. For centuries, India's capital income remained stagnant, and by 1928 it had collapsed. The consequences were devastating. Famine, poverty, and disease ravaged the population. Millions of Indians died due to British policies that prioritized profits over people. During times of famine, the British exported food grains, leaving Indians to starve. The numbers are staggering. In just 40 years, between 1880 and 1920, British colonialism killed 100 million Indians. This is a staggering toll, one that is hard to comprehend. But the damage didn't stop there. Extreme poverty in India increased under British rule, rising from 23% in 1810 to over 50% by the mid-20th century. This means that more than half of India's population was living in abject poverty, struggling to survive. The British claimed to be bringing civilization and progress to India, but the reality was far different. They exploited India's resources, destroyed its industries, and left its people to suffer. The British East India Company's introduction of machine-made goods from Britain was a deliberate blow to India's traditional handloom and cottage industries. The livelihoods of millions of Indian artisans and weavers were undermined as they struggled to compete with the cheaper mass-produced goods from Britain. The consequences were devastating. India's traditional industries began to collapse, leading to widespread poverty and unemployment. The once thriving textile industry of India, which had supplied fine fabrics to the world, was reduced to a mere shadow of its former self. The problems that emerged from this policy were taken up by anti-colonial nationalist movements as their main agenda. The destruction of conventional economic sectors, the exclusion of affected regions from retail, and the never-ending food shortages were all painful sequences of colonialism. This exploitation deepened regional imbalance and social inequalities in India. The British colonialists exploited India's resources, destroyed its industries, and left its people to suffer. The impact of this policy can still be seen today, with many Indian regions continuing to struggle with poverty and underdevelopment. The British claimed that their policies were designed to modernize India and bring it into the industrial age. But the reality was far different. Their policies were designed to exploit India's resources, destroy its industries, and enslave its people. The destruction of India's traditional industries was a deliberate act of economic warfare, designed to break the backbone of India's economy and reduce it to a state of dependence. It was a policy that was driven by greed, racism, and a desire to exploit India's resources for the benefit of British colonialists. The British East India Company's trade monopoly system was a cleverly designed scam, It allowed the British to plunder India's wealth without paying a single rupee. Here's how it worked. Anyone who wanted to buy goods from India had to use special council bills. These bills could only be obtained by buying them from London with gold or silver. Indians, on the other hand, were paid in rupees, which were taken from their own tax revenues. The result was a massive transfer of wealth from India to Britain. London ended up with all the gold and silver, while Indians were left with worthless rupees. This was not a trade agreement, but a blatant robbery. India's trade with the rest of the world was flourishing, but it showed up as a deficit in the national accounts. Why? Because the real income from India's exports was pocketed by the British. To make matters worse, India was forced to borrow from Britain to finance its imports. This created a debt trap that ensnared the entire Indian population. Indians were forced to pay interest on loans that were used to buy British goods. It was a vicious cycle of debt and exploitation. The British East India Company's trade monopoly system was a colonial scam that ruined India's economy. It was a deliberate attempt to drain India's wealth and enslave its people. The British claimed that they were bringing civilization and progress to India, but the reality was far different. They were using India as a cash cow, milking its wealth to fuel their own economic growth. It was a shameful and exploitative policy that continues to spark outrage and controversy today.